Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's show, we're talking advanced therapeutic regulatory strategy with a woman whose entire career has been focused on navigating international biopharma regulatory waters. After earning her PhD in chemistry from ETH Zurich and doing her postdoctoral work at EPFL, Dr. Daniela Drago kicked off a distinguished career in regulatory affairs, spanning companies including Hoffmann La Roche, V4 Pharma, Reckitt Benckiser, Bausch & Lomb, and Biogen. She also spent nearly 7 years teaching as an associate professor at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Services, as well as serving as director of clinical and translational research and regulatory affairs there. Dr. Drago is a committee member for the American Course on Drug Development and Regulatory Sciences at UC San Francisco, where she also serves on the faculty. And since August 2021, she's been Chief Regulatory Officer at Aurion Biotech, where she's helping to steer the company's pipeline of cell therapy candidates addressing corneal endothelial disease. Dr. Drago, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. Did I get pronunciations correct there? Did I?
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. I got your name. I know I got your name right because we practiced that before we started recording. But the am I pronouncing Aurion? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. Awesome. So I wanna begin by getting to know you a little bit better. Coming out of your postdoc, when I look at your CV, coming out of your postdoc, it looks like you did this brief stint in nanotechnology research. Before jumping headlong into biotech regulatory affairs, which is where your career has stayed for the past several years and where you've gained all this expertise. But I'm curious, when I see something like that, I wonder where the motivation came from to come out of school, do a little bit of research in an R&D capacity, and then make a shift where you've stuck, for lack of a better term, for quite some time now.
Thank you, Matt. Indeed, I should say that I landed in regulatory against all odds, like you identified. I graduated with a PhD from ETH and then a postdoc at EPFL, like you were mentioning, before I was offered my first position in regulatory, which was at Hoffmann La Roche in Basel. So I have done pretty well research-wise, and I had the privilege to be educated in very prestigious universities. So the expectation was for me to make a career in research and academia. But what attracted me to regulatory affairs and kept me in the profession is that this field offers a great combination of science, law, and business. Also, early on, I developed an interest in translations. I speak multiple languages, including German, Italian, and some Spanish and French. And I worked at both ends of the drug development translational spectrum, from bench chemistry to regulatory science and policy. So interest is what is serving me well as I collaborate across functions, geographies, and cultures.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and I think that'll play well into this conversation because a bit later on, I think I want to dig into some regulatory affairs specific issues with you, more specifically international regulatory affairs and how to navigate that water. And I'm sure that background in those multiple languages have propelled your career, or at least helped. But first, before we get into that, I want to learn a bit more about Aurion. You're relatively new company and new to me. So tell us a little bit about that. What are you guys working? Tell us about the pipeline for starters. What are you working on?
Yes, so we are focused on developing an innovative platform of advanced therapies to treat ocular diseases. And Matt, as you often discuss with others and as you know, of the landscape in cell and gene therapies, in advanced therapies, as our scientific understanding of disease pathology and therapeutic targets improves, many developers are increasingly turning to advanced therapies to overcome the limitation of other modalities. So, for example, if we look at small molecules or other biologics such as monoclonal antibodies, they often require repeated administration over a lengthy period of time, especially for patients with chronic condition. And they only treat symptoms rather than the cause of the disease. And that is why the mission at Aurion is different. Our mission is to restore vision to millions of patients with life-changing advanced therapies.
Yeah. Yep. And the indications, tell us a little bit about the indications that you aim to address, and maybe give us some perspective on the potential patient population and what the market might look like there.
Excellent question. Thank you, Matt. Our lead candidate is a cell therapy for the treatment of corneal endothelial disease. And maybe not everyone in the audience might know that more than 16 million people suffer from it globally. Also, the endothelium is the innermost monolayer of cells in the cornea, and it performs a crucial hydration function. It is what enables individuals to see clearly. What happens is that when endothelial cells die, either through aging or a disease or surgical trauma, they do not regenerate anymore. So when they degenerate, the cornea swells and vision worsens. If this is left untreated, it leads to blindness. You might find interesting, Matt, that today millions of people go untreated because their only option is a cornea transplant. And also not everyone might know that the cornea supply, the global cornea supply, does not meet demand. There is, for example, a survey that was published by JAMA that found that for one available cornea, there are 70 diseased eyes that would compete for it.
Wow. Yeah, that's so certainly an unmet need. I'm curious about the timing of your arrival on the scene. So you joined the company late last summer, August 2021.
Yeah.
Why was that or was it a strategic time for Aurion, on its development timeline to hire a chief regulatory officer?
Yes, and here is the rationale. Aurion acquired the technology from KPUM in Japan in late 2020. And Professor Kinoshita's research was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And our colleagues in Japan treated more than 65 patients with excellent clinical outcomes. The ability that we have at Aurion and our core innovation is to get endothelial cells to produce at scale so that one available cornea can treat up to 100 eyes. It was really critical for the organization to have someone like me to work with the team on a global regulatory strategy. And our focus right now is to prepare for an IND submission with the FDA.
Okay. Yeah, that's an IND submission with the FDA in addition to some, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but in addition to clinical activity in some other places like the EU and Japan, hence the international regulatory strategy theme of our conversation. So let's shift gears there a little bit and talk a little bit about what that regulatory landscape looks like. And this is a very, Dr. Drago, this is a very kind of 30,000 foot view question that it's just a big open-ended question I'm going to ask you and allow you to kind of take it wherever the mood strikes you. But how would you sort of summarize the current state of the regulatory path specific to therapies such as those that Aurion is working on?
Another excellent question, Matt. Thank you. I believe it is fair to say that advanced therapies, specifically cell and gene therapies, really hold the potential to transform global healthcare. and that the rapid growth of cell and gene therapies pipelines is testimony of this.
Mm.
On the regulatory landscape, the lack of established regulatory frameworks in many countries for these unique, complex, and innovative products poses challenges to medicine developers. The health authorities that are more experienced with cell and gene therapies have adopted requirements and practices that are unique to these products. For example, the European Medicines Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration have several guidelines that are specific to cell and gene therapies. Mm-hmm. However, regulatory requirements vary across regions, and this results in sponsor uncertainty when dealing with multinational development programs. It is even more acute in the case of rare diseases. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. It might be more complex for sponsors in this area to reach concurrence on novel endpoints or try to have a more aligned approach in terms of recommendation for long-term follow-ups.
Mm-hmm. When you're looking at the state of the regulatory path in cell and gene therapy, what would you say? Like if you look across the regions that you just mentioned, mm-hmm. Where you're working, the U.S., EU, Japan. You're simultaneously engaged in clinical activity in all those regions. What are some of those inefficiencies? And I guess one of the questions I guess I would ask as a follow-up is, or in tandem with that question would be, are the inefficiencies a result of perhaps regulatory bodies not keeping pace with the advanced complexity of the therapeutics themselves? Or is it simply a case of different regulatory bodies working under different standard operating procedures, or a combination of the two, perhaps?
Thank you. I think it is really multifactorial. But if I look at inefficiencies, mm-hmm. I believe they fall into three categories. Number one is the lack of established regulatory frameworks for cell and gene therapies in many countries. When countries try to repurpose existing frameworks, they stretch the boundaries of their regulations. And some of these requirements really are not applicable. Number two, when you think about the US, Europe, and Japan, there are differences in requirements for countries with dedicated regulatory frameworks. But this causes sponsors that are dealing with multinational programs to, at times, conduct duplicative work, which is a waste of resources. And then number three, there are inefficiencies in the area of sourcing and using quality raw or starting materials. Obtaining quality raw materials is difficult for cell and gene therapies due to the need to use human and animal-derived materials. And there are issues in variability in lot-to-lot performance, for example. Mm-hmm. So those are three key categories that I would see.
So how are you, like, if you face those challenges, those three kind of big overarching challenges you just mentioned, mm-hmm. To what degree, in your capacity as a CRO, as a chief regulatory officer, do you have some ability or tools in your toolbox to work within those challenges, to create efficiencies perhaps where they don't currently exist due to those three reasons?
There are different options. And de facto right now in the field, there are several initiatives, some of which already ongoing, that can create efficiencies. Some for short-term benefit and some for long-term benefits. But they will help overcome barriers. Again, the key ones, I see them in three categories. Number one, for regulatory authorities around the world to be more open towards innovative trial designs. For example, the typical paradigm of clinical development for cell and gene therapies is shifting from the typical phase 1, 2, and 3 process into phase 1, combined phase 2 and 3, and then post-approval. Number 2, for countries working on dedicated frameworks, there is a lot of activity on the policy, on the regulatory policy side, to make sure that these countries include mechanisms for accelerated pathways. As you well know, Matt, many cell and gene therapies address an unmet medical need in treating a serious disease. So to enable early access to patients, accelerated pathways can shorten the development and the review timelines. And then number 3, and this is something I'm very passionate about, is the use of regulatory reliance. Now, regulatory reliance, for those in the audience that might not be that familiar with that, is the act where a national regulatory authority in one country may take into account the assessment performed by another national regulatory authority, enriching its own decisions. Now, it's important to emphasize that even when a national regulatory authority uses a reliance pathway, it maintains responsibility for the decision in its own jurisdiction. Okay. So reliance is not outsourcing of decision-making, and it's not a less robust form of regulation.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. It occurs to me that in a situation like that, there is the potential for, political persuasion. There's the potential for, sort of a follow the leader mentality where, perhaps, maybe one region is reluctant to engage in any semblance of reliance on another region. And I'm not going to name names here or make any assumptions. I'm just curious about your take on that. Historically, the FDA has been, sort of considered the gold standard of regulatory, international regulatory authorities. I don't know whether that reputation has perhaps been tarnished a bit in recent months and years. But what's your take overall on the state there? Like, as far as that reliance mechanism is meant to work, what are the potential barriers to allowing it to work?
Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you. Because
and I don't, Daniela, I don't want to put you on the spot either. Don't get yourself in trouble with any particular regulatory agencies.
Don't worry. I have actually a really good answer that is not coming from me, but from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They, I believe it was in 2019, they convened an expert committee to study indeed the role of regulatory reliance and how can it be fostered. And the consensus of this report is that there are 2 different roles for national regulators in relation to reliance. One is an unidirectional reliance activity, where a well-resourced and regulator provides assessment to a less resourced regulator. But they also talk about horizontal reliance activities. And those are among well-resourced regulators that share similar requirements and similar competencies, but they might not have it at the same time. So it is based on trust, like you say, but let me give you a couple of really successful examples of this. One is the Access Consortium. This is a collaborative initiative between Australia, Health Canada, Switzerland, Singapore, and now also the UK. And then even more advanced type of reliance is recognition. And if you think of mutual recognition agreements between the US and Europe on the inspection front, those are some of these type of reliance successful ones.
Okay, cool. What influence does industry, i.e. sponsors, have on advancing programs like that, advancing initiatives and alliances like that, if any? I'm just curious, like, you've been in the space for quite some time, working in industry, working for sponsor companies. Is it a deal with it as it evolves situation, or is there an active effort on the part of professionals such as yourself to kind of move the ball forward?
I think there are very many things that professionals can do. One is, if possible, still be active scholarly. So, for example, the ability for individuals also working in industry to still be part of the more academic discourse, or even collaborate with regulators and publish. There are opportunities to work in the policy side, either through trade organizations like bio or pharma, or through professional associations like, for example, the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapies, or ARM, or others.
Okay, very good. Put yourself, okay, so I don't have to ask you to put yourself in these shoes because you've been in these shoes, but speaking, I should say, directly to leaders such as yourself in roles such as yours, who are perhaps new to the game, new and emerging biopharma regulatory affairs specialists. What would you tell them about the most, I guess, perilous or risky steps in the regulatory process, and maybe particularly, if you want to address it this way, in the international coordination of international regulatory approaches? What are the most perilous steps that they should be aware of? That you would sort of throw a warning out, like, hey, you really want to be prepared for this.
Yeah, one common pitfall that I see new startup companies doing is, for example, especially if I think of them working on their first IND in the US and CTA in Europe, and so navigating this even in an international fashion. The common pitfall is failing to target the documents for the regulatory reviewer. Picture this: the customer is a busy and often overworked regulatory reviewer, and your file is just another one in a long line of applications. So trust me, a grumpy reviewer is not your best friend. So let me give you maybe 3 tips for preparing submissions and interacting with regulators.
Yeah.
Number 1 is to collect and submit data that demonstrate your claims. Do not assume that the reviewer will agree with you necessarily. Number 2 is to write organized and easy to follow submissions. Easier said than done, but it's something where it's important to have a lot of focus. And then number 3 is to take advantage of scientific advice meetings. So either in the US or Europe or wherever you want to bring your clinical trials. It's good to do so by asking focused questions, providing a risk analysis and scientific rationale for a different approach. And if people in the audience remember only one thing from this podcast, please be this one. Do not ask for advice and then ignore it.
So let's clarify that. It's okay to ask for advice. It's okay to ask for advice in those meetings, but if you ask for advice and you ignore it, you're setting yourself up for problems.
Yeah, and let me maybe clarify that when you ask for advice, the way that is adequate to do it is to have a company position and then ask if the regulators would agree with that position. So when companies are engaging with regulators, it's not a good idea to ask open questions. Questions should be framed in the context of, do you agree? Or does the agency concur with blank? And so on. Open questions are not adequate.
Right, sure. Probably not appreciated by the agencies, right? Like we're not. You're not here to glean expertise from us. Where that advice does come in that exchange, how is it best to, I guess, how is it best exhibited that the advice has been taken into consideration and addressed the next time you submit or meet?
There are different ways to do it in different jurisdictions. Let me take the US for as an example. For companies that are developing cell and gene therapies have the opportunity to request interact meetings. Those are relatively new meetings that replace the pre-IND meetings. When there are questions that were asked and answered at the interact meeting, and the company is holding a pre-IND meeting, then it would not be adequate to either re-ask the same questions or, if not, integrate the advice that was received at the interact meeting in the briefing book that is used for the pre-IND.
Yep. Okay. So you've given us some great advice, some very sound, concrete advice for folks who are in roles like yours. Now I wanna ask you to sort of comment on what the regulatory bodies could be doing better. So you know, as I mentioned, you guys are Aurion is engaging in some clinical activity across the EU, Japan, and the United States of America. As you do that, I'm sure that there are days, Dr. Drago, where you're thinking to yourself, boy, it would make a lot of sense if these three agencies that I'm trying to, collaborate with all simultaneously did X better, right? Or did more of this. So if you were to plead to those agencies or plead with them to make some efficiency gains, what could they do more collaboratively to create better efficiency and therefore better, more quickly enable therapeutic progress?
Yeah, I think that it's to do more of what they recently started doing, which is collaborate with each other. When I first started in the profession, Matt, there was not a lot of collaboration, even not between well-resourced agencies. This paradigm completely shifted. There are now not only informal, but also formal forums where regulators discuss, exchange. And this, I think, is something that helps with regulatory convergence. And this is another regulatory concept that is often defined as a voluntary process where requirements across countries become more uniform or more aligned. And this is often the result of a gradual adoption of recognized standards or guidance documents or scientific principles. Convergence is much more rapid and less formal than harmonization. As you well know, a very common example of harmonization is ICH, and where harmonization is the development of shared guidelines that are used across participating authorities. This is obviously ideal, but it also takes a long time. So I think that more collaborations among different authorities can foster convergence, and that's great for sponsors, but also other stakeholders.
Yeah, excellent. Let me ask you this: Can you? So you've seen this progress happen, and it sounds to me like it's you're enthusiastic about the progress that you're seeing, and that's a good thing. But if you look at, given your experience and the time that you've been in the space and this progress that you've seen, if you look forward, if you fast forward, I don't know, 20 years, is it possible, this is sort of a philosophical question, is it possible that the pendulum could swing too far towards too much collaboration and harmonization to the point where we lose some inherent, skepticism, checks and balances, peer review among that, international regulatory agencies? Could it go that far? Is there any danger there?
I don't think so, Matt. I feel that regulatory authorities want to keep responsibility for the decision in their own jurisdiction. So I think that although we might see more reliance on some aspect, the ultimate decision for the patients and consumers in a particular jurisdiction will be bared by that national or regional agency. But I think that what is striving towards more reliance is that this is a pathway that emerged as a potential strategy to bring efficiency and optimize resources, but indeed without sacrificing product quality, safety, or efficacy, nor the responsibility over a certain jurisdiction.
Okay. So you've shared, like, as I said, some really good practical advice for regulatory officers such as yourself in new and emerging bio. Now I'm going to ask you to share maybe some day-to-day secrets, tips, tricks, whatever it might be, in terms of sort of the daily buttons you're pushing, levers you're turning, around creating efficiencies on the regulatory path. Because, as I mentioned from the outset, right, you were brought in August 2021 to do a thing for a company that's at a stage in its continuum where it needs that thing done. IND submissions, navigation of these regulatory bodies. So on the daily, as you're going about that business, what are some of the daily and common tips and tricks you might share with other regulatory officers, that is, with new and emerging biotechs?
Yeah, the first one we kind of discussed, which is engage with the regulators, do it early, often, and do it in a way that is well planned. So recognizing that good relationships with regulators are helpful for discussing and mitigating issues. But I think it's also really important to stay current on emerging trends. I encourage individuals and companies to join organizations such as the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapy or the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine and attend their annual meetings. And finally, I think more holistically, remain curious and develop a network of trusted colleagues in the industry. And don't be afraid to ask questions. We are all learning together.
Yeah. The relationship point that you just mentioned, build and maintain these relationships with regulatory agencies. What are the keys there? Because that seems like it would be particularly challenging in this day and age. I think there are, I don't know what the number's up to. I mean, cell and gene therapy, clinical trials number, I don't know, close to a couple thousand, I think, globally right now. I could be off on that, but I don't think I'm too far off. ATMPs, these complex advanced therapies are just growing and growing and growing to the point that, to your point earlier, you're trying to establish relationships with overworked, under-resourced regulatory officials who are moving through these files, rapidly all day long. What are some of the keys? What are some of the keys to establishing that relationship that gets you noticed and gets you the respect and time that you need to move forward?
Yeah, I think some things that one can do is be credible. Let me expand on this.
Mm-hmm.
There is also a couple of new initiatives focusing on the US, for example. OTAT will revise their website with much richer content on IND requirements and best practices, because they also realize that high quality submissions it's equal to more efficient reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Submitting a high quality submission will give you an entry to have better, more meaningful discussions when you get a meeting granted. They are also, and this is still OTAT, they also announced that they will pilot a new initiative in 2022 to inform sponsors very early during the 30-day window about either the status or the deficiencies of IND review. Because also their goal is to reduce the number of sponsors on clinical hold because of the lack of time to respond to information requests late in the IND review. So I think that to work on more quality submissions in order to be credible and then be able to have a meeting granted because there is the opportunity to have that meaningful discussion is a great place to start.
Excellent. All right. So I want to wrap things up, Dr. Drago, by getting your take on where things are headed from here. I mean, we've throughout the course of the conversation, we've made several notes on the current state of international regulatory affairs. We've talked about the fact that there are a growing number of therapies under review. The regulatory agencies are overworked for sure. At the same time, you've shared a lot of enthusiasm around progress being made on the collaboration front. Where's the momentum headed now? Is the momentum will that positive collaboration continue? Will it be stalled by the fact that there are too many needs and too many players looking for attention right now? Give us sort of your outlook in 2022 and beyond of what this landscape will look like.
I think that we can frame this in the context of some of the learnings that we can take from the COVID-19 experience and apply going forward. So I believe that although the COVID-19 crisis exposed vulnerabilities in the global healthcare system, it also stimulated innovation and encouraged the adaptation of new solutions. So I think in a way, the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated changes that were already taking place, such as, for example, the broader use of telemedicine or the application of advanced analytics. So many regulators also at workshops and meetings discussed how they are actively engaged in exploring approaches on how do we all turn the COVID experience into something productive.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the flexibility and openness that regulators have demonstrated in their response to the COVID-19 will hopefully extend beyond the crisis and at times create a shift from anomaly to precedent.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, we have seen unprecedented I guess, level of flexibility. I know firsthand, at least here in the U.S., and hopefully that does continue and work its way. I hope that that influence and precedent does work its way beyond COVID into fields like yours, because it's such important work that you're doing.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah. Well, it's my pleasure to have you on the show. I look forward to the next time. We'll be paying attention to the clinical journey there at Aurion. Congratulations on your relatively new role, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Drago.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
So that's Aurion Biotech's Dr. Daniela Drago. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is The Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva. Check out Cytiva's Biotech Accelerator, built for the leaders of new and emerging biotech at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Check us out and sign up for my newsletter at bioprocessonline.com. And if you're enjoying the pod, please subscribe. Swipe all the way to the right and give us 5 stars. And as always, thanks for listening.